In the 6th century before the Common Era, the Indian subcontinent stood at a crossroads of thought and suffering. Ancient kingdoms rose and fell through lineage and warfare. Society was rigidly divided by caste, and spiritual life was dominated by ritual rather than understanding. Priests guarded sacred knowledge. Sacrifices promised cosmic order, and the common human question of suffering was often answered with obedience instead of insight. It was an age of external certainty, but internal unrest, an era historians would later call part of the axial age, when civilizations across the world began questioning existence itself. And it was within this climate of unease, hierarchy, and silent despair that the life of Siddhartha Gautama began. Siddhartha was born into the Shakya clan, a small but proud, ruling family located near the Himalayan foothills, politically cautious, socially disciplined, and deeply invested in preserving its independence. His father, King Suddhodana, was not an emperor but a regional ruler, a man whose authority depended on stability, alliances, and continuity. The birth of an heir was not merely a personal event. It was a political necessity, according to early Buddhist texts. Siddhartha's birth occurred in Lumbini, a peaceful grove where his mother, Queen Maya, stopped during a journey. Tradition describes the moment with symbolism rather than spectacle. The queen standing beneath a flowering sal tree, the child emerging into a world briefly stilled. Later texts speak of signs and wonders, of purity and destiny, not as historical reportage, but as a language ancient cultures used to mark extraordinary lives. Queen Maya died days after giving birth, a fact often softened by legend, but historically significant. Siddhartha grew up without his biological mother, raised instead by her sister, Mahapajapati Gautami, whose presence grounded his early life in care rather than myth. This early loss, though unremembered consciously, created a subtle absence, a quiet fracture that would later echo through Siddhartha's sensitivity to impermanence and attachment. Even before he could articulate such concepts, life had already introduced him to loss. Soon after Siddhartha's birth, sages and seers were invited to examine the child. Among them was the ascetic Asita, an aged hermit respected for his insight. According to tradition, Asita recognized marks of greatness upon the infant, signs indicating to possible destinies. Either Siddhartha would become a universal monarch, ruling vast territories through power, or he would renounce the world entirely and become a fully awakened being, a Buddha, one who understands the nature of suffering and its end. The story tells that Asita wept not in sorrow for the child, but because he himself would not live long enough to see which destiny would unfold. Historians understand this account not as a literal prediction, but as a symbolic framework, an early attempt to articulate the tension that would define Siddhartha's life: power versus wisdom, domination versus understanding. For King Suddhodana, the prophecy was unsettling. Spiritual renunciation threatened everything he had built. A son who abandoned kingship would leave the Shakya clan vulnerable, exposed, and weakened. And so the king resolved to shape destiny through control. His strategy was simple. If Siddhartha never encountered suffering, he would never question existence. If pain remained unseen, The path of renunciation would never open. This was not cruelty, but fear rooted in love and political survival. And it led to one of the most deliberate experiments in human insulation ever attempted. Siddhartha's childhood unfolded inside carefully curated perfection. Palace walls separated him from the world beyond. Gardens bloomed in all seasons. Music filled the halls. Servants were trained to remove discomfort before it could be felt. Illness, aging, death, even the sight of grief were forbidden from his presence. The king believed that pleasure could anchor the mind, that satisfaction could prevent questioning. Yet this artificial harmony came at a cost, for reality denied does not disappear, it waits. Siddhartha received the education expected of a royal heir. He was trained in martial disciplines, archery, swordsmanship, horse riding, skills necessary for leadership in a volatile region. Yet violence did not excite him. Strategy did not intoxicate him. He learned governance, law, diplomacy, and the sacred teachings of the Vedic tradition. But rather than absorbing them as absolute truths, he approached them with curiosity. His teachers noticed that he did not argue, but he did not accept easily either. He listened, reflected, and withdrew inward. Where other princes sought validation, Siddhartha sought understanding, accounts. Describe him as calm, observant, and unusually introspective. A child who watched more than he spoke. Legends preserve an early moment when Siddhartha, left alone beneath a rose apple tree during a ceremonial festival, entered a deep meditative state spontaneously. His breathing slowed, his awareness sharpened, and his mind settled into stillness. Without instruction, this episode, though later emphasized by tradition, points to something historically plausible. An early capacity for concentration and inner absorption, qualities that would later define his path. As Siddhartha matured, King Suddhodana intensified efforts to bind him to worldly life. Luxury increased, responsibilities were postponed, and distractions multiplied. Marriage was arranged with Yasodhara, a noble woman of intelligence and composure. Their union was affectionate but structured, existing within the same controlled environment that defined Siddhartha's upbringing. When their son Rahula was born, the king believed the final anchor was set. Fatherhood would tether Siddhartha to duty, legacy, and continuity, yet the effect was the opposite. The sight of his infant son awakened not possession, but awareness. Siddhartha saw vulnerability, dependency, and the certainty of loss embedded. Within love itself, attachment no longer felt comforting, it felt heavy. Despite every effort to preserve the illusion, Siddhartha's inner unease deepened. This was not dissatisfaction with pleasure, but a growing sense that pleasure itself was incomplete, that something essential was missing from the life presented to him. He began spending long periods alone, reflecting, withdrawing into silence. Palace life continued around him, but his attention turned inward. King Suddhodana interpreted this as danger. Introspection threatened obedience, and so control tightened further. Outings were restricted, companions carefully chosen. The prince's exposure to the world remained limited, but the mind does not require permission to question, unbeknownst to the king. The very conditions designed to prevent awakening were sharpening it, for a mind raised in perfect comfort when finally confronted with reality. does not adjust gradually, it breaks open. Siddhartha's life had become a sealed chamber of denial, and the pressure of unanswered questions was building. The illusion was nearing collapse. Beyond the palace walls, the world waited. Aging, sickness, death, and wandering seekers moved freely through the streets of Kapilavastu, untouched by royal decree. The truth Siddhartha had been shielded from was not malevolent. It was simply human, and soon, through a series of encounters that would shatter his understanding of existence, the protected prince would come face to face with the realities his father had tried so desperately to hide. The first phase of Siddhartha Gautama's journey was drawing to a close. The foundations were laid. The mind prepared, the question formed, and the moment approached when illusion would meet truth. Not gently, but irrevocably. The palace of Kapilavastu had been designed to preserve certainty. Yet certainty cannot survive forever when built on denial. Siddhartha Gautama had reached an age where the boundaries of his world began to feel less like protection and more like confinement. The silence he carried within him was no longer peaceful. It was questioning, persistent, and unresolved. Despite the king's vigilance, curiosity found its way to the surface, not as rebellion, but as a quiet insistence to see what lay beyond the walls that defined his life, according to early accounts. Siddhartha requested permission to leave the palace grounds, not to escape, but to observe the city his father ruled, King Suddhodana. Reluctant yet confident that years of insulation had done their work, agreed under strict conditions. The streets were to be cleared of anything unpleasant. No sick, no elderly, no mourning, no signs of decay or hardship were to be visible. The city was instructed to perform normalcy, to mirror the illusion of the palace itself. And so Siddhartha departed, accompanied by his charioteer, Channa, unaware that this carefully staged journey would dismantle everything he believed he understood about life. The first encounter occurred quietly, without spectacle. Siddhartha saw an old man, bent, fragile, moving slowly through the street. His body marked by time, his strength diminished, his presence unavoidable. Siddhartha had never seen aging before, not as an abstract idea, but as a living reality. He turned to Channa with confusion rather than fear, asking what affliction had reduced the man so profoundly. Channa explained that aging was not a condition, but a certainty, that all who live long enough experience this decline. This simple statement struck Siddhartha with unexpected force. The realization was not merely that bodies change, but that youth, beauty, and strength are temporary by nature. The first crack appeared in the illusion. Permanence, the foundation of palace life, revealed itself as a lie. On another journey, Siddhartha encountered a sick man, trembling, fevered, powerless. His body betrayed by forces beyond his control. The prince, accustomed to perfection, struggled to comprehend what he was witnessing. Again he questioned Channa, and again the answer was devastating in its simplicity. Sickness was not an anomaly. It was a common fate. Any body could be overtaken by illness without warning. Siddhartha's mind began to trace the implications. If health could vanish without reason, then pleasure was unstable. If the body could rebel, then control was an illusion. Suffering was not the result of moral failure. It was woven into existence itself. The third encounter was final, unavoidable. Siddhartha saw a funeral procession. A lifeless body carried by grieving figures, their faces etched with loss. No amount of preparation could soften the meaning of death. It was absolute, irreversible, and universal. Siddhartha did not ask Channa what death was. He understood instinctively. What unsettled him was not mortality alone, but the realization that all the joy, beauty, ambition, and attachment cultivated within the palace were destined to end in the same silence. Death did not discriminate between kings and servants, youth and age, devotion and denial. The illusion of safety collapsed completely. These three encounters, old age, sickness, and death, are known collectively as the first three sights. And while tradition presents them as distinct moments, historians understand them as a condensed representation of a broader psychological awakening. Siddhartha was confronting the inescapable realities of human existence, realities systematically hidden from him. The shock was not that suffering existed, but that it was universal, unavoidable, and unaddressed by power, wealth, or ritual. The fourth sight differed in nature. Siddhartha encountered a wandering ascetic, a man who owned nothing, renounced comfort, and walked the world with deliberate simplicity. Unlike the sick or the dying, this figure did not radiate despair. There was calm in his posture, clarity in his eyes, and purpose in his movement. Siddhartha sensed something radically different. Here was a human being who acknowledged suffering, and yet was not crushed by it. When Siddhartha asked Channa about the man, he learned that ascetics renounced worldly life in search of truth, liberation, or understanding for the first time. Siddhartha glimpsed an alternative response to suffering, neither denial nor indulgence, but inquiry. The impact of the four sights cannot be overstated. They did not merely disturb Siddhartha. They reorganized his understanding of reality. The palace world, built on permanence, pleasure, and control, dissolved. In its place emerged a vision of life defined by change, vulnerability, and uncertainty. The question that now haunted Siddhartha was no longer abstract. It was urgent. If suffering is universal, then how should one live if everything changes? What can be trusted if death is inevitable? What meaning remains? Siddhartha returned to the palace altered, yet outwardly unchanged. The walls still gleamed. Music still played. Servants still bowed. But the illusion no longer held. Luxury now felt hollow. Pleasure felt temporary. And routine felt dishonest. His interactions grew distant, not from indifference, but from awareness. Even his love for Yasodhara and Rahula became complicated, not diminished, but shadowed by the certainty of loss. Attachment, once encouraged as stability, now appeared as a source of suffering. King Suddhodana sensed the shift immediately. The prince's gaze had changed. Where once it was calm, it now carried depth. Where once it was passive, it now carried weight. The king responded by intensifying containment, more entertainment, more indulgence, more effort to drown questioning in pleasure. Yet pleasure no longer distracted Siddhartha. It clarified his discomfort. Each moment of enjoyment now carried an unspoken question. What happens when this ends? Tradition records Siddhartha wandering the palace halls at night, observing sleeping dancers, musicians, and courtiers, their bodies slack, their beauty unguarded, their humanity exposed. These scenes are often described poetically, but their psychological significance is clear. Siddhartha was witnessing impermanence even within luxury. The illusion of control dissolved further, revealing life as it truly was: transient, vulnerable, and unresolved. The prince's inner conflict reached its peak. He stood between two worlds, one defined by duty, power, and expectation, the other by uncertainty, renunciation, and unanswered questions. Neither path promised comfort, but only one promised honesty. Siddhartha was not rejecting responsibility. He was confronting the possibility that ruling a kingdom could not resolve the fundamental problem of human suffering. Power could enforce order, but it could not prevent aging, sickness, or death. Authority could command obedience, but it could not command meaning. The presence of the ascetic lingered in his mind, a living example of another way, not a solution, but a direction. Siddhartha began to realize that knowledge guarded by priests and rituals did not address the reality he had witnessed. Sacrifice did not end suffering. Prayer did not halt decay. Obedience did not prevent death. The question he now faced was not whether suffering existed, but whether it could be understood and transcended. These realizations unfolded not in public declaration, but in silence. Siddhartha did not preach, protest, or rebel. He reflected, he observed, and he prepared inwardly for a decision that would redefine his identity. The path before him was narrowing. The palace world no longer aligned with his understanding of truth, yet leaving it would mean abandoning his father, his wife, his child, and the role he had been raised to fulfill. The weight of this conflict pressed heavily upon him. In Buddhist tradition, this period is described as one of profound inner turmoil, a mind torn between compassion and detachment, responsibility and freedom. Historians recognize this not as a mystical crisis, but as a deeply human one. Siddhartha was confronting the limits of inherited identity, realizing that the life assigned to him could not answer the questions he now carried. The foresights had not offered solutions. They had stripped away denial, and in doing so, made inaction impossible. The world beyond the palace had revealed itself, not as hostile, but as honest, and honesty, once seen, cannot be unseen. Siddhartha's life stood at a threshold. The path of renunciation, once a distant abstraction, now felt inevitable, not as escape, but as responsibility to truth. The night approached when decision would replace contemplation, when awareness would demand action. The illusion had collapsed, suffering had revealed itself, and the prince who had been protected from reality was now preparing to walk directly into it. Not as a ruler, but as a seeker. The moment of renunciation was near, and with it, the irreversible turning point of Siddhartha Gautama's life. As the nights in Kapilavastu grew quieter, and the palace lights dimmed into routine, Siddhartha Gautama found himself increasingly awake while the world round him slept. The encounters beyond the palace walls had not faded with time. They had deepened. Aging, sickness, death, and the calm figure of the ascetic replayed in his awareness not as images, but as truths. Truths that could no longer be reconciled with silk cushions, music, or ceremonial smiles. The palace remained unchanged. Yet Siddhartha felt as though he was living inside a shell that no longer fit. Every sound of laughter carried an echo of impermanence. Every gesture of comfort carried the certainty of loss. And every role he was expected to play now felt like a performance staged against reality. Rather than aligned with it, the prince was not rebelling against his life. He was outgrowing it, according to Buddhist tradition. This period was marked by intense inner struggle, not the struggle of temptation versus virtue, but of compassion versus attachment. Siddhartha loved his wife Yasodhara. He loved his son Rahula, and he respected his father deeply. Yet love itself had become complicated, not because it had weakened, but because it had revealed its vulnerability. Attachment now appeared inseparable from suffering. To love was to fear loss. To possess was to guarantee grief, and Siddhartha could not unsee this truth. The more he tried to remain within the palace world, the more dishonest it felt, as if staying would be a betrayal not of his family, but of reality itself. Tradition describes a night when Siddhartha wandered through the palace halls, observing dancers and courtiers asleep, their carefully composed beauty dissolved in unconsciousness, their bodies slack, their expressions unguarded, the elegance of court life stripped down to its human core. This scene is often rendered poetically, yet its psychological meaning is clear. Siddhartha was witnessing impermanence even within luxury. The illusion that pleasure could preserve dignity collapsed completely. Power, beauty, youth, all surrendered to time the moment awareness faded. And Siddhartha understood that no amount of control could protect life from change. The birth of Rahula weighed heavily upon him. His son represented continuity, lineage, and the future of the Shakya clan. Yet Siddhartha perceived another meaning within the moment. Rahula literally means fetter or bond, not as a rejection of the child, but as an acknowledgement of attachment. Siddhartha realized that staying would not eliminate suffering for his son. It would only delay his confrontation with it. And the question that now consumed him was not how to protect those he loved from pain, but whether it was possible to understand suffering deeply enough to transcend it, not for himself alone, but for all beings. King Suddhodana sensed the danger approaching, but misunderstood its nature. He believed Siddhartha's unrest could still be softened, still be distracted, still be contained, yet awareness once awakened cannot be returned to sleep. Siddhartha's silence had become resolve, not dramatic, not announced, but steady. He was not planning escape. He was preparing renunciation, and these are not the same. Escape runs from responsibility. Renunciation walks directly into it, according to the traditional accounts. On a night heavy with stillness, Siddhartha made his decision. The palace slept, the city rested, and the world beyond the walls remained indifferent. Siddhartha requested his charioteer Channa to prepare his horse, Kanthoka, a white stallion later elevated by legend, yet historically understood as a symbol of departure rather than divinity. This was not a heroic charge into battle. It was a quiet leaving. The most difficult departures are never loud before leaving. Siddhartha paused outside the chamber where Yasodhara and Rahula slept. Tradition emphasizes this moment not to dramatize abandonment, but to highlight restraint. Siddhartha did not wake them, not from lack of love, but from recognition of its power. He knew that if he looked upon his son's eyes while awake, he might never leave, and so he chose silence over sentiment. Not because love was absent, but because attachment was too strong. This was the cost of the path he was choosing. The renunciation was not of comfort alone, but of certainty, identity, and belonging. The act of leaving the palace is often framed mythologically, with gods opening gates and spirits silencing guards. Historians interpret these elements symbolically, representing the psychological reality that once the decision was made, nothing external could stop it. Siddhartha passed beyond the walls that had defined his life, stepping into a world he had never fully seen, no longer as prince, but as seeker. The moment was irreversible. There would be no partial return. No compromise between palace and truth. Beyond the city limits, Siddhartha dismounted, removed his royal garments, and cut his hair. These actions carried profound symbolic meaning in ancient India. Clothing marked social identity. Hair signified status and caste. By removing both, Siddhartha was not disguising himself. He was shedding identity itself. The prince did not become poor. He became undefined. He gave his ornaments to Channa, instructing him to return them to the palace. This was not an act of contempt, but of closure. Siddhartha was not rejecting his past. He was releasing it at this moment. Siddhartha's transformation was complete in form, but not yet in understanding. He had renounced power, comfort, and lineage, but he had not yet discovered truth. The romantic notion of immediate enlightenment is absent from early accounts. Instead, what follows is uncertainty, wandering, vulnerability, and failure. Siddhartha did not know the path. He only knew that remaining where he was would be dishonest. Renunciation was not a solution. It was an opening. The night of departure marks one of the most radical acts in recorded history, not because a man gave up a throne, but because he rejected the assumption that power could resolve the human condition. Siddhartha was not seeking divinity. He was seeking understanding. And he accepted that understanding might demand suffering rather than avoid it. This inversion of values, from accumulation to release, from authority to inquiry, from certainty to openness, is what gives the great renunciation its enduring significance. As dawn approached, Siddhartha walked onward into uncertainty, leaving behind the life designed for him. The world he entered was harsh, unstructured, and indifferent, yet it was honest, and honesty, once chosen, becomes a form of courage. The prince had become a wanderer, the heir had become a student, and the first irreversible step toward awakening had been taken not beneath a tree, not in meditation, but in movement, away from illusion and into reality. What awaited Siddhartha was not peace, but years of struggle, discipline, error, and insight. The path ahead would test his body, his mind, and his resolve. The great renunciation did not end suffering. It invited it as a teacher. And in the silence of that early morning, as Kapilavastu receded behind him, Siddhartha Gautama stepped fully into the unknown, carrying nothing but awareness and an unanswerable question. How can suffering be understood? And can it truly end? As Siddhartha Gautama walked away from Kapilavastu and the life that had defined him, he did not step into clarity, but into uncertainty. The road ahead offered no map, no promise, and no protection, only the raw exposure of existence stripped of privilege. The former prince now moved through forests, villages, and dusty paths as a wanderer, carrying no symbols of rank, no wealth, and no certainty beyond the question that drove him forward. How suffering arises, and whether it can truly end. The world he entered was harsh and indifferent. Hunger was no longer hidden. Fatigue was no longer softened by servants. And the body that once rested on silk now slept on bare ground. This was not punishment. It was education. The first lesson of renunciation was vulnerability. In the cultural landscape of ancient India, Siddhartha was not alone in his search. The forests were filled with ascetics, philosophers, and seekers who had rejected household life in pursuit of liberation. Some practiced silence, some mortified the body, some pursued altered states of consciousness. This was a time of intense spiritual experimentation, where inherited ritual authority was being questioned, and truth was sought through direct experience rather than obedience. Siddhartha entered this world not as a teacher, but as a student, willing to learn from anyone who claimed insight. His first significant teachers were Alara Kalama and later Adukkha Ramaputta, respected meditation masters, known for their ability to guide disciples into deep states of concentration. Siddhartha approached them with humility, discipline, and extraordinary focus. Under their instruction, he mastered advanced meditative absorptions, states of awareness so refined that ordinary perception dissolved. The body became distant, thought slowed, and consciousness appeared vast and still. These experiences were powerful, and in many traditions they were considered the highest spiritual achievement possible. Siddhartha progressed rapidly, impressing his teachers and peers alike. Yet despite this mastery, something essential remained unresolved when Siddhartha emerged from these states. Suffering returned, hunger returned, uncertainty returned, and most importantly, ignorance returned. The meditative absorptions brought temporary peace, but not understanding. They offered escape, not insight. Siddhartha realized that these states depended on conditions, posture, breath, focus, and when those conditions ended, the peace dissolved. This insight was critical. Liberation, if it existed, could not be dependent on temporary states. It had to transform understanding itself. Respectfully, Siddhartha left his teachers, not in rejection, but in recognition of limitation. This departure marked a subtle but important shift. He was no longer seeking refined experiences. He was seeking truth that endured beyond experience. This distinction would later define his teaching, but at this stage, it left him without guidance. And so he turned toward the most extreme path available, asceticism. In the belief systems of the time, the body was often viewed as an obstacle to liberation. Desire was seen as the root of bondage, and suffering was interpreted as purification. The harsher the discipline, the closer one came to truth. Siddhartha embraced this logic fully. If pleasure had failed him in the palace, perhaps pain would succeed where comfort had not. And so he joined a small group of ascetics who practiced severe self-denial. Together they withdrew into forests and wilderness, reducing food to the bare minimum, controlling breath, enduring heat and cold, and pushing the body toward its limits. For years, Siddhartha practiced extreme austerity. He fasted until his body weakened, his limbs thinned, his spine protruded, his breath became shallow. Later descriptions portray him as a living skeleton, skin clinging to bone, eyes sunken yet alert. This period is often romanticized, but historically it represents a profound experiment. Siddhartha was testing the prevailing assumption that self-mortification leads to wisdom. He endured pain not as punishment, but as inquiry, asking through experience whether suffering could burn away ignorance. Yet even at the edge of physical collapse, understanding did not arise. Pain sharpened awareness, but did not clarify it. Suffering intensified, but it did not reveal its own solution. Siddhartha found that extreme asceticism produced another form of attachment to endurance, to achievement, to identity as a holy man. The ego survived even starvation. Pride could exist in pain just as it existed in luxury. This realization struck him with the same force as the foresights. The path of extremes was not liberation. It was another illusion. The moment of collapse came quietly. Siddhartha's body, weakened beyond function, could no longer sustain meditation. Breath control became dangerous, consciousness blurred, and death approached not as metaphor, but as reality. At this point, a village woman named Sujata offered him a bowl of milk and rice, an act of simple generosity that would later become symbolic. Siddhartha accepted the food, not as indulgence, but as necessity. Nourishment restored strength, clarity returned, and with it came one of the most important insights of his life. The realization that neither indulgence nor self-torture leads to awakening. This decision shocked his fellow ascetics, who interpreted his acceptance of food as failure, as weakness, as betrayal of the path. They abandoned him, leaving Siddhartha alone once more. Yet this isolation was different. It was no longer driven by confusion. It was driven by clarity. Siddhartha had discovered something radical. Truth does not rise from extremes. It arises from balance. This understanding would later crystallize as the middle way. But at this stage, it was an intuition rather than a doctrine. The wanderer's years had stripped Siddhartha of illusions. On both ends of the spectrum, palace luxury had failed to protect him from suffering, and ascetic extremism had failed to explain it. Teachers had offered techniques, but not transformation. Pain had offered intensity, but not insight. What remained was a quiet, grounded awareness, a body restored enough to sit, and a mind no longer chasing escape. Siddhartha was no longer searching outwardly. He was preparing inwardly. As he walked toward the banks of the Naranjana River, the weight of years settled into stillness. The wanderer who had left Kapilavastu, driven by unrest, now carried a different quality: patience, humility, and resolve. The search had failed in every expected way, and in that failure, something essential had been revealed. Truth would not be found through borrowed systems, borrowed pain, or borrowed authority. It would have to be discovered directly, alone, without extremes, without escape. The years of wandering had not brought enlightenment, but they had done something equally necessary. They had cleared the ground, stripped away inherited assumptions, tested the limits of body and mind, and revealed the futility of every path that avoided direct understanding. Siddhartha Gautama now stood at the edge of a turning point. No longer a prince, no longer an ascetic defined by suffering, but a seeker who had exhausted every external answer. Ahead of him lay a single decision, not about where to go, but how to sit beneath a tree that would later be called the Bodhi Tree. Siddhartha would soon make a vow that would change the course of human thought. The wanderer's years were ending, and the confrontation with the deepest layers of the mind was about to begin. As the sun rose over the quiet banks of the Naranjana River and light touched the land that had witnessed Siddhartha Gautama's long vigil, there was no outward sign of transformation. No thunder, no proclamation, only a profound stillness. The man who had sat through the night did not rise as a conqueror or prophet. He rose as someone who had understood, and that understanding brought not excitement, but gravity. The Buddha did not immediately speak, teach, or declare what he had seen. Instead, he remained in silence for days, walking slowly, standing beneath trees, observing the world with a clarity that no longer divided experience into desirable and undesirable. The awakening had ended seeking, but had not yet given direction. Insight had dissolved ignorance, but compassion had not yet found its voice. And this interval of silence is essential to understanding the Buddha as a human teacher. Rather than a mythic figure, according to tradition, the Buddha spent weeks in contemplation, reflecting on the depth of what had been realized, the structure of suffering, its origin in craving, its cessation through understanding, and the path that allows this understanding to rise. Yet alongside this clarity, another realization emerged. The truth he had seen was subtle, counterintuitive, and difficult to grasp. It challenged desire, identity, and certainty, and the Buddha questioned whether it could be communicated at all. This hesitation is often overlooked, yet it reveals the humility of the awakening. Enlightenment did not inflate the ego, it dissolved it. And without ego, there was no urgency to convert or convince, only a concern for whether teaching would help or confuse. Buddhist tradition frames this moment mythologically, describing the god Brahma Sahampati appearing before the Buddha and urging him to teach for the sake of those with little dust in their eyes. Historians interpret this not as a literal divine intervention, but as a symbolic expression of internal deliberation, the recognition that while many would resist or misunderstand, some were ready, some were capable of insight, and withholding the path entirely would be an act of indifference rather than wisdom. Compassion, not ambition, became the deciding force. The Buddha resolved to teach, not because the world demanded it, but because suffering continued regardless of his silence, and understanding without sharing would be incomplete. His first thought turned to the ascetics who had once practiced with him, the 5 companions who had abandoned him when he accepted food and strength. They had dismissed him as fallen from the path, Yet they possessed discipline, sincerity, and familiarity with suffering. The Buddha sensed they might understand. And so he began to walk towards Sarnath, near the city of Varanasi. The journey itself carried meaning. The Buddha traveled on foot, dependent on alms, unadorned, presenting no authority except presence. When the 5 ascetics saw him approaching, they resolved not to acknowledge him, believing he had returned to indulgence. Yet, as he drew closer, something in his bearing unsettled them. The clarity of his posture, the steadiness of his gaze, the absence of striving. They rose instinctively, offering him a seat. And in that moment, the first subtle transmission occurred. Before words, before doctrine, the Buddha taught through being. What followed is known as the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. The Buddha did not begin with metaphysics or cosmology. He spoke directly to the condition they all shared: suffering, dissatisfaction, the unease woven into existence. He explained that suffering is not a punishment, not fate, not the result of divine will, but a natural consequence of craving and misunderstanding. He spoke of the Four Noble Truths, that suffering exists, that it arises from craving, that it can cease, and that there is a path leading to its cessation. This path was not extreme, not indulgent, not punitive, but balanced, later called the Eightfold Path, encompassing wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline. The Buddha emphasized that liberation was not achieved through belief, ritual, or obedience, but through direct understanding, cultivated in daily life. The ascetics listened, and as the teaching unfolded, something shifted. One of them, Kondana, grasped the essence, recognizing the impermanent and conditioned nature of experience. This moment marked the birth of the Sangha, the community of practitioners, not as an institution of power, but as a fellowship of inquiry. The Buddha did not claim authority over them. He invited them to see for themselves. His language was precise, pragmatic, and grounded in experience, avoiding speculation and focusing instead on what alleviates suffering here and now. This teaching style distinguished him from other spiritual figures of the time. He did not promise salvation. He offered a method. He did not demand faith. He encouraged investigation. The weeks following the first sermon saw the gradual formation of a small community. Men who chose homelessness not as escape, but as practice. Renouncing possessions to reduce distraction, living by ethical restraint to stabilize the mind, and cultivating awareness to penetrate illusion. The Buddha moved among them not as a ruler, but as a guide, correcting gently, observing closely, allowing insight to arise rather than imposing it. Word of his teaching began to spread, not through miracles but through transformation. Those who encountered him noticed calm without detachment, compassion without sentimentality, authority without dominance. The Buddha's awakening did not remove him from humanity. It returned him to it more fully, yet challenges lay ahead. Opposition from established religious authorities, misunderstandings from followers, and the slow work of translating insight into a life of teaching. The silence after awakening had ended, but the journey of communicating truth without distorting, it had only begun. And with each step, the Buddha would test whether understanding could survive contact with the world. As the Buddha continued walking from place to place with a small group of newly awakened companions, the teaching that had begun quietly at Sarnath started to take shape as a living movement. Rather than a fixed doctrine, the Sangha was not founded as an institution of authority, but as a field of shared practice. A space where individuals committed themselves to understanding suffering through discipline, ethical conduct, and direct awareness. The Buddha made it clear from the beginning that he was not creating a hierarchy. He did not appoint priests, demand worship, or claim divine status. Instead, he positioned himself as a guide who had walked the path and could point the way, but could not walk it for others. This approach was radical in a society structured around caste, ritual privilege, and inherited authority, and it immediately distinguished the Dharma from existing religious systems. The Buddha's method of teaching was pragmatic and adaptive. He did not repeat the same words to everyone. He listened first, observing temperament, background, and capacity, and then shaped his language accordingly. To farmers, he spoke of seeds and soil. To merchants, he spoke of debt and profit. To kings, he spoke of governance and responsibility. To ascetics, he spoke of discipline and balance. This skillful means, later known as upaya, allowed the teaching to remain rooted in experience rather than abstraction, and it prevented the Dharma from hardening into ideology. The Buddha avoided metaphysical speculation, refusing to answer questions about the origin of the universe or the nature of the soul, when such questions did not lead to liberation. This restraint frustrated some seekers, but clarified his purpose. Suffering was the problem. Understanding was the solution. Everything else was secondary. As this Sangha grew, the Buddha established guidelines not as commandments, but as supports. Ethical precepts were introduced not as moral absolutes, but as practical tools. Refraining from violence, false speech, theft, sexual misconduct, and intoxication stabilized the mind and reduced harm, creating conditions in which insight could arise. Meditation practices were refined. Mindfulness of breath, body, feelings, and mental states became central, not to escape the world, but to observe it clearly. The Buddha emphasized that awakening was not a trance or altered state, but a continuous awareness woven into daily life. Walking, eating, speaking, and resting all became fields of practice. The spread of the Dharma brought the Buddha into contact with all levels of society. Kings invited him to their courts, intrigued by his calm authority. Merchants offered support. After witnessing the transformation of their peers, villagers listened, as suffering was named without judgment, and outcasts found dignity in a teaching that denied caste as a measure of worth. One of the most significant moments occurred when the Buddha accepted members of all social backgrounds into the Sangha, declaring that liberation was not determined by birth but by understanding. This challenged deeply entrenched hierarchies and provoked resistance from orthodox Brahmanical authorities. Yet the Buddha did not argue publicly or seek confrontation. He allowed the teaching to speak through conduct and clarity. The inclusion of women marked another profound shift. After initial hesitation, the Buddha permitted women to join the monastic community, led by his foster mother Mahapajapati Gautama. This decision reflected both cultural constraint and ethical evolution. While the Buddha acknowledged the limitations imposed by society, he affirmed women's capacity for awakening, stating clearly that liberation was not restricted by gender. This inclusion was unprecedented and reshaped the spiritual landscape of the region, though it also introduced new complexities and challenges within the Sangha. As years passed, the Buddha's reputation spread, not as a miracle worker, but as a teacher of uncommon insight. Stories circulated of individuals transformed by simple encounters. A murderer named Angulimala abandoning violence after meeting the Buddha. A grieving mother Kisagatomi realizing the universality of death through a single instruction. These narratives, preserved in tradition, function not as legends of supernatural power, but as demonstrations of psychological precision. The Buddha addressed suffering at its root by revealing misunderstanding, not by offering consolation alone. His presence did not remove pain, it reframed it, yet growth brought tension. Not all who joined the Sangha were free from ambition, pride, or resentment. Devadatta, the Buddha's cousin, sought authority and recognition, attempting to divide the community through stricter rules and personal rivalry. The Buddha responded not with punishment, but with restraint, allowing consequences to unfold naturally. This episode revealed another dimension of the teaching. Awakening does not eliminate conflict. It changes how conflict is met. The Buddha neither clung to control nor withdrew from responsibility. He maintained clarity without hostility. Throughout these years, the Buddha continued to age, his body subject to the same conditions he taught about. Illness, fatigue, and pain were acknowledged openly, never denied or dramatized. This transparency reinforced the central message: enlightenment does not transcend humanity, it understands it. The Buddha did not claim immunity from suffering. He demonstrated freedom from confusion about it. His teaching matured alongside his body, becoming increasingly refined, compassionate, and grounded. The Dharma spread slowly but steadily, carried not by conquest or conversion, but by example. Communities formed along trade routes and riverbanks. Practitioners adapted the teachings to local conditions while preserving their core. The Buddha encouraged questioning, famously advising followers not to accept his words out of reverence, but to test them against their own experience. This invitation to inquiry ensured that the teaching remained alive rather than dogmatic, and it laid the foundation for its endurance beyond his lifetime. As the Buddha entered the later decades of his life, the Sangha had grown into a diverse and resilient community. Yet the impermanence he taught was now approaching him personally. The body weakened. Journeys became slower, and the awareness of finality grew sharper. The teacher, who had spent years guiding others toward understanding, was now preparing for his own departure, not with fear, but with acceptance. The Dharma had taken root, but the question of how it would endure without its founder remained. And the final chapters of the Buddha's life would confront this question directly, testing whether a path grounded in insight could survive beyond the presence of the One who had first walked it. As the years passed, and the Buddha moved deeper into the later stages of his life, the clarity that had once radiated effortlessly through a strong and disciplined body now had to coexist with the undeniable reality of aging. The teacher who had spoken so often of impermanence began to embody it visibly. His steps slowed, his back ached. Illness visited more frequently, and fatigue followed even short journeys. Yet none of this altered the steadiness of his awareness. Instead, it refined it. The Buddha did not conceal his physical decline, nor did he frame it as spiritual failure. He acknowledged pain openly, teaching through example that enlightenment does not grant immunity from the conditions of the body. It grants freedom from confusion about them. This honesty deepened the trust of those around him, for they saw a teacher who did not rise above humanity but stood fully within it. During this period, internal tensions within the Sangha became more pronounced as the community expanded. So too did the diversity of motivations among its members. Some sought liberation sincerely, others sought belonging, status, or authority. The most significant challenge emerged in the figure of Devadatta, the Buddha's cousin, whose ambition gradually eclipsed his understanding. Devadatta desired control over the Sangha and proposed stricter ascetic rules, not out of compassion, but out of competition. He believed severity would establish superiority. And when the Buddha refused to impose these measures, emphasizing balance and intention over outward display, Devadatta's frustration hardened into resentment. Tradition records several attempts by Devadatta to undermine or harm the Buddha, including plots of physical violence. Historians interpret these stories symbolically as well as literally, reflecting the inevitable presence of ego and rivalry. Even within spiritual communities, the Buddha's response was neither retaliation nor exclusion. He neither demonized Devadatta nor defended himself theatrically. He allowed consequences to unfold, demonstrating a core principle of the Dharma. Actions bear fruit according to their intention, not according to judgment imposed by authority. Devadatta's influence waned as his motives became evident, and the Sangha learned through experience rather than decree. The Buddha used these conflicts as teaching moments, emphasizing that awakening does not eliminate the possibility of wrongdoing, but it changes how wrongdoing is met, not with hatred or fear, but with clarity and responsibility. The Sangha was encouraged to rely on the Dharma rather than personalities, to test teachings through practice rather than loyalty, and to recognize that no individual, not even the Buddha himself, was exempt from impermanence. This insistence on self-reliance prepared the community for a future without its founder. As his body weakened further, the Buddha adjusted his teaching style. Long discourses became shorter, instruction more distilled. Repetition gave way to emphasis. Mindfulness, ethical conduct, and wisdom remained central, but now carried a sense of urgency. Not panic, but precision. The Buddha spoke increasingly about decay, dissolution, and death, not morbidly, but matter-of-factly, reinforcing that the path was not about postponing reality, but understanding it fully. His presence continued to draw kings and commoners alike, yet he accepted invitations, selectively conserving strength, demonstrating through restraint that discernment is itself a form of wisdom. One of the most profound aspects of this period was the Buddha's consistent refusal to appoint a successor. When asked who would lead the Sangha after his passing, he replied that the Dharma itself was the teacher. That truth does not reside in individuals, but in understanding. This refusal unsettled some and empowered others. It reinforced the revolutionary nature of his teaching. Authority was decentralized, responsibility returned to the practitioner. Liberation could not be inherited, commanded, or delegated. It had to be realized directly. The Buddha's acceptance of impermanence extended to his own life. He spoke openly of his approaching death, encouraging disciples not to grieve prematurely, but to deepen practice, reminding them that clinging to his form would contradict everything he had taught. This was not detachment devoid of feeling. It was compassion grounded in realism. He acknowledged sorrow without being governed by it, modeling the balance he had articulated throughout his life. As the final phase approached, the Buddha continued to travel despite illness, refusing to withdraw completely from the world he had spent decades engaging. He walked not out of obligation, but out of connection. Each village, each encounter, each teaching now carried the weight of finality. Yet there was no theatrical farewell, no grand summary of doctrine, only consistent emphasis on awareness, ethical conduct, and insight. The path remained the same, only time had changed. The Sangha, witnessing the gradual fading of the Buddha's physical presence, began to internalize the lesson he had lived, that reliance on external figures must give way to internal understanding. Grief and reverence intertwined. Yet the Buddha gently redirected attention away from himself and back toward practice, reminding his followers that the Dharma was not something he owned, but something he pointed to, something available to anyone willing to see clearly. The man who had once left a palace in search of truth now approached the end of his life, having reshaped the inner landscape of countless individuals. Yet he carried no sense of achievement or legacy, only acceptance. The final journey was nearing, and with it the ultimate demonstration of impermanence. The Buddha would soon face death not as a teacher instructing others, but as a human being embodying the understanding he had spent a lifetime articulating. And in that embodiment, the teaching would reach its quiet completion. As the Buddha entered the final months of his life, the pace of his movement slowed, but the clarity of his presence remained unchanged. The journeys grew shorter, the rests more frequent, yet the intention behind each step was steady. He was fully aware that the body which had carried him across forests, villages, and kingdoms for decades was approaching its end, and he did not resist this knowledge. Instead, he used it as the final teaching, not through abstraction, but through embodiment. The Buddha continued traveling with a small group of close disciples, among them Ananda, whose devotion and sensitivity made him especially attentive to the Buddha's condition. Along the way, the Buddha spoke often of impermanence, not as philosophy, but as lived reality, reminding his followers that everything conditioned must pass, including the one who had shown them the path. This was not spoken with sadness, but with precision, a calm insistence that understanding must replace attachment. During this final journey, the Buddha fell ill. Tradition describes the illness arising after a meal offered by a lay follower named Kanda. Accounts vary in detail, some describing spoiled food, others a simple physical reaction. Historians agree that the exact cause is less important than the response. The Buddha experienced pain, weakness, and discomfort. Yet he did not blame the giver nor dramatize the suffering. Instead, he instructed Ananda to reassure Kanda, emphasizing intention over outcome, teaching that generosity offered with sincerity bears no fault, even if consequences arise beyond control. This moment reveals the depth of the Buddha's ethical clarity, responsibility rooted in awareness rather than guilt. As his condition worsened, concerns spread among the disciples. Many struggled with fear, grief, and uncertainty. The Buddha addressed them directly, urging them not to seek refuge in his presence, but in their own understanding. His words during this period are among the most significant of his life. He reminded them that all compounded things are subject to decay, and that liberation depends not on proximity to a teacher, but on diligence in practice. Famously, he instructed them to be lamps unto themselves, relying on the Dharma as their guide rather than on any individual. This statement encapsulated the revolutionary core of his teaching, authority rooted in insight rather than hierarchy. As the group reached the region of Kushinagar, the Buddha recognized that the end was near. He asked to rest between Tasao trees, lying on his side in a posture of composed awareness. The scene described in tradition is quiet and restrained, not triumphant, not tragic. The trees blooming out of season symbolize reverence in later retellings. Yet historically, they represent the natural world continuing its rhythms. Regardless of human significance, disciples gathered, some weeping, others silent, all aware that this moment marked the passing of not only a man, but an era. In his final hours, the Buddha continued teaching, answering questions patiently, clarifying misunderstandings, ensuring that the Sangha understood the path without ambiguity. One last seeker approached, uncertain and anxious, and the Buddha welcomed him, demonstrating that compassion does not withdraw at the edge of death. He reaffirmed the central insight that liberation is possible here and now through understanding, that no external salvation is required, that the path is available to anyone willing to see clearly. These were not final commandments, but reminders of what had always been taught. As the night deepened, the Buddha's breathing became shallow, awareness remained steady, and the process of dying unfolded without resistance. According to tradition, he entered progressively deeper states of meditative absorption, not to escape death, but to meet it fully. The final moments were marked not by fear or struggle, but by cessation, the ending of conditioned experience. This passing is known as Parinirvana, the complete extinguishing of ignorance and suffering, not annihilation, but release from the cycle of craving and rebirth as understood in the framework of the teaching. When the Buddha passed, there was no proclamation, no divine intervention, only silence. The disciples were left with grief, reverence, and responsibility. The teacher was gone, but the Dharma remained. The body was cremated. Relics were distributed, not as objects of worship, but as reminders of impermanence. The Sangha now faced its greatest test. Whether a path grounded in insight rather than authority could endure without its founder, whether understanding could survive memory, and whether compassion could persist without guidance. The Buddha's death did not conclude his teaching, it activated it. The absence of the teacher forced the disciples to embody the path themselves, to rely on mindfulness, ethical conduct, and wisdom rather than presence. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was space. Space for the Dharma to live beyond the life of one human being. The journey that had begun with a protected prince ended with a human death. And in that completion, the Buddha's message reached its fullest expression. Nothing is permanent. Nothing can be possessed. And freedom lies not in escaping reality, but in understanding it completely. After the passing of the Buddha into Parinirvana, the silence that followed was not merely emotional, but existential. The Sangha now stood without the physical presence of the One who had walked ahead of them for decades. Grief moved through the community, yet alongside sorrow there was urgency. The awareness that memory fades and misunderstanding grows if insight is not preserved with care. The Buddha had left no written texts, no appointed successor, no centralized authority, only teachings carried in living minds. And this absence of structure was both a challenge and a test. The disciples understood that the Dharma could survive only if it was remembered accurately and practiced sincerely, and so shortly after the Buddha's death. Senior monks gathered at Rayagaha in what later tradition calls the First Buddhist Council, not as a display of power, but as an act of collective responsibility. The council was led by Mahakasapa, one of the Buddha's most disciplined disciples, chosen not for charisma, but for integrity. Ananda, who had been the Buddha's close attendant and possessed an extraordinary memory, recited the discourses he had heard directly. While Apolli recited the rules of monastic discipline, this oral recitation was not casual storytelling. It followed strict methods of repetition and cross-verification, ensuring consistency across voices. Historians understand this process as an early attempt at preserving intellectual integrity. In an oral culture, the teachings were not frozen as scripture yet. They remained living instructions, adaptable but anchored as years passed. The Sangha spread beyond the regions the Buddha had personally walked. Monks traveled along trade routes, settled near villages, and adapted the teachings to local languages and customs while preserving their core. This expansion was gradual, not missionary in the later sense. The Dharma moved through example rather than coercion. Kings such as Bimbisara and later Ashoka would support the Sangha, but this came generations after the Buddha. Initially, the teaching survived through simplicity, discipline, and relevance. It spoke to suffering in a way that transcended class, caste, and geography. Differences in interpretation naturally arose. Councils were held to address disputes, not to impose uniformity, but to clarify intention. Over time, distinct schools of thought emerged, reflecting regional perspectives and philosophical emphasis. Yet all trace their foundation back to the same core insight. Suffering arises from misunderstanding, and freedom rises from awareness. The absence of a central authority meant that Buddhism evolved organically, sometimes unevenly, but this flexibility allowed it to survive across centuries and cultures. The legacy of the Buddha gradually shifted from the memory of a man to the embodiment of a path. Statues, stupas, and rituals developed over time, not as replacements for understanding, but as supports for remembrance. Mythology expanded, stories grew richer, symbols became layered. Yet beneath these cultural expressions, the essential teaching endured: mindfulness, ethical living, wisdom, compassion, the Buddha himself was never positioned as a creator god. Even in later devotional forms, he remained a teacher, one who pointed rather than commanded. As Buddhism spread beyond India into Sri Lanka, Central Asia, China, Southeast Asia, and eventually East Asia, the teaching encountered new philosophies, new challenges, and new interpretations. Meditation techniques diversified. Philosophical schools debated the nature of mind and reality, yet the core question remained unchanged. How does suffering arise, and how can it end? This universality allowed the Dharma to adapt without losing itself. It addressed the human condition rather than a single culture. Centuries later, as empires rose and fell, the historical Siddhartha Gautama receded into time. Yet his insight continued to shape inner lives. The Buddha's refusal to claim authority, his insistence on inquiry, and his emphasis on direct experience ensured that his teaching remained relevant long after the social conditions that produced it had vanished. The path he articulated did not depend on belief in miracles, lineage, or revelation. It depended on observation, honesty, and discipline. In this way, the Buddha's greatest legacy was not an institution, a doctrine, or a civilization, but a method, a way of seeing that could be rediscovered by each generation. The journey that began with a sheltered prince ended not in conquest or collapse, but in continuity, a quiet transmission of understanding across time, reminding humanity that freedom is not found by escaping life, but by understanding it deeply, and that even in a world defined by change, clarity remains possible. As the centuries unfolded after the Buddha's passing, his physical absence became increasingly distant, yet the questions he had confronted grew only more relevant. The Dharma no longer moved only through wandering monks and oral recitation. It became embedded in cultures, languages, philosophies, and inner lives across vast regions. Yet this expansion carried both strength and tension. The further the teaching traveled from its origin, the greater the challenge of preserving its essence without hardening it into dogma. Early Buddhist communities grappled with this balance. How to honor the Buddha's insight without turning him into an object of dependence. How to preserve teachings without freezing inquiry. And how to build institutions without recreating the very attachments. The path was meant to dissolve. Over time, councils continued to refine, debate, and organize the teachings, not because the Dharma was unclear, but because human interpretation inevitably varies. Different schools emerged emphasizing different aspects of the path. Some focused on disciplined monastic life, others on philosophical analysis, others on devotional practice as a support for mindfulness. Historians recognize these developments not as corruption, but as adaptation. The Buddha had taught according to capacity, and now the Dharma itself adapted according to context. What remained constant was the central insight that suffering arises from clinging to what is impermanent and misunderstanding the nature of experience. As Buddhism encountered new civilizations, it absorbed local symbols and languages while reshaping them internally. In some regions, the Buddha was depicted as a serene teacher. In others, as a cosmic figure embodying compassion and wisdom. Mythology expanded. Stories multiplied, and ritual forms developed. Yet beneath these expressions, the core practice persisted. Attention to breath, awareness of thought, ethical restraint, and insight into impermanence. The Buddha's original refusal to claim divine status allowed this diversity. Because the teaching was not anchored to a single image of authority, it was anchored to experience. Philosophical inquiry deepened as well. Buddhist thinkers analyzed the nature of mind, perception, causality, and emptiness, refining language to articulate insights that resist expression. These debates were not abstract exercises. They were attempts to prevent misunderstanding. To ensure that insight did not collapse into belief, meditation practices evolved in parallel, some emphasizing concentration, others insight, others compassion. Yet all traced their legitimacy back to the same experiential foundation: direct observation of reality as it unfolds at the same time. The Dharma faced periods of decline and resurgence. Political shifts, patronage, and persecution shaped its visibility. Yet the teaching proved resilient precisely because it did not rely on external power. When institutions weakened, practice continued in forests, villages, and individual minds. The Buddha's insistence on self-reliance ensured that the path could survive without centralized control. No empire could own it, and no collapse could erase it entirely in modern times. As scientific inquiry and psychology emerged, the Buddha's insights found new resonance. Concepts such as mindfulness, impermanence, and non-attachment were reframed in secular language, studied empirically, and applied therapeutically. This translation sparked debate. Some feared dilution. Others saw continuity. Historians observe that this adaptation mirrors earlier transformations. The Dharma has always shifted its expression while retaining its function. To illuminate suffering and point toward freedom, the Buddha's life, viewed across time, reveals a paradox. A man who rejected authority became one of the most influential figures in history. A teaching that discouraged clinging generated vast traditions, and a path that emphasized impermanence endured for millennia. This endurance does not rest on myth alone. It rests on relevance. Suffering remains, confusion persists, and the questions the Buddha asked have not expired. Ultimately, the Buddha's legacy cannot be measured by temples built or texts preserved, but by the quiet moments of awareness cultivated by countless individuals. Moments when craving loosens, fear softens, and clarity emerges. The journey that began with a sheltered prince and ended with a calm death continues wherever attention meets experience honestly. The Dharma does not demand belief, it invites seeing. And as long as human beings seek to understand their own suffering, the path the Buddha articulated remains unfinished, alive, and available. As the long arc of time stretches beyond councils, kingdoms, and cultures, the story of Gautama Buddha settles into something quieter yet deeper than chronology. It becomes a mirror held up to the human condition itself. The prince who once lived, shielded from suffering, now stands in memory not as a ruler of lands or a founder of dogma, but as a witness to reality. His journey reveals a pattern that repeats endlessly across generations. Comfort gives rise to unease. Unease gives rise to questioning. Questioning leads either to escape or to understanding. And understanding demands courage. The Buddha's life does not offer reassurance that life will be gentle. It offers clarity that suffering has causes and therefore can be understood. This clarity is what allowed the Dharma to move beyond the boundaries of a single era and become a living inquiry rather than a finished answer. The blended traditions that grew around the Buddha, stories of signs at his birth, visions beneath the Bodhi Tree, reverence from gods and kings, serve not to elevate him beyond humanity, but to express in symbolic language the magnitude of inner transformation. Ancient cultures spoke in myth because myth carried meaning where analysis could not. Yet when stripped of ornament, the core remains unmistakably human. A mind that looked directly at impermanence without turning away. A heart that responded to suffering without hardening. And a discipline that refused both indulgence and cruelty. This balance is what allowed the Buddha's teaching to endure through constant change. Because it aligned with the structure of experience itself, rather than with any fixed belief. Across centuries, interpreters have argued over doctrine, rituals have multiplied, institutions have risen and fallen, yet the essential challenge remains unchanged. Can attention remain steady in the presence of discomfort? Can desire be observed without obedience? Can identity be questioned without fear? The Buddha did not answer these questions for humanity. He demonstrated how they might be explored. His refusal to claim final authority ensured that the path remained open rather than closed, unfinished rather than complete. Each generation inherits not a solution, but a responsibility. The Buddha's death, like his life, resists spectacle. There is no promise of rescue, no external salvation, only the quiet insistence that understanding is possible and that ignorance is not fate. The Parinirvana does not remove the Buddha from the world. It removes the illusion that liberation depends on his presence. What remains is the Dharma as a living process, a way of seeing that must be renewed in each moment or it fades into memory. This is both the fragility and the strength of the path. In this way, the story of Gautama Buddha ends not with closure, but with invitation. The prince who walked away from certainty did not replace it with belief. He replaced it with inquiry. The wanderer who failed on every borrowed path did not find a secret doctrine. He discovered a way of looking. The teacher who refused succession ensured that no one could stand in his place. Because the place he pointed to was within experience itself. Time continues, empires dissolve, cultures transform, yet suffering persists. And so too does the relevance of a life that met suffering without denial, without hatred, and without escape. To remember the Buddha is not to recite his story, but to recognize its reflection in one's own restlessness, one's own clinging, one's own fear of change. The path does not belong to history. It unfolds wherever awareness meets the present moment honestly. And in that unfolding, the Buddha is neither distant nor divine, but present as a possibility, a reminder that freedom is not found by leaving the world behind, but by seeing it clearly, fully, and without illusion. And so the story rests not in the past, but in the continuous question that remains alive wherever a human mind turns toward understanding. As the Buddha's story continues beyond his physical life and settles into the long memory of humanity, it begins to function less as biography and more as a psychological map, a framework through which generations have examined the nature of mind, desire, fear, and freedom. What makes this legacy unique is not the preservation of events, but the preservation of method. The Buddha did not leave commandments etched in stone. He left questions sharpened by experience. Questions that refuse to age because they arise. Wherever humans confront uncertainty, dissatisfaction, and change. This is why the Dharma survives translation, reinterpretation, and even misunderstanding. Because at its core it is not an answer imposed from outside, but an invitation to observe what is already present. In later centuries, as Buddhism interacted with diverse cultures, the figure of the Buddha expanded symbolically, sometimes appearing as a cosmic teacher, sometimes as an embodiment of compassion, sometimes as a philosophical ideal. Mythology grew richer, imagery more elaborate, yet these developments reflect human need rather than distortion. Societies expressed insight through the language they understood. And the Buddha's refusal to anchor truth in his own personality allowed this symbolic expansion. Without erasing the original intent, the danger was never myth itself, but forgetting what myth points toward: awareness, impermanence, and the cessation of clinging. Philosophically, Buddhist thinkers explored the implications of the Buddha's awakening with increasing depth. Concepts such as emptiness, dependent arising, and non-self were refined to prevent subtle forms of attachment from reasserting themselves. These were not abstract theories, but safeguards. Reminders that even insight can become an object of clinging if not examined continuously. The Buddha's original emphasis on direct experience remained the reference point. No matter how complex the analysis became, the test was always the same. Does this reduce suffering or increase confusion? Psychologically, the Buddha's journey offers a rare honesty. It does not promise transformation without cost. It does not romanticize renunciation, and it does not deny the persistence of pain. Instead, it reframes pain as information, something to be understood rather than avoided. This approach resonates across eras because it aligns with human experience. Rather than idealized perfection, the Buddha was not remembered as flawless, but as awake, and this distinction preserves accessibility. Awakening is not reserved for extraordinary beings. It is possible wherever attention and honesty meet. The tension between institutional Buddhism and the original spirit of the Dharma has persisted throughout history. Monasteries, rituals, and hierarchies provided stability. Yet they also risked replacing inquiry with obedience whenever this occurred. Reform movements arose, returning emphasis to meditation, ethics, and insight. This cyclical pattern reflects the Buddha's own teaching that structures are useful but impermanent and must be questioned rather than worshipped. The Dharma corrects itself through awareness. In the modern world, the Buddha's insights have entered secular discourse, stripped of ritual and cosmology, reframed as mindfulness, cognitive awareness, and emotional regulation. Some view this as dilution, others as continuation. Historically, it represents the same adaptive process seen across centuries. The teaching shifts language but preserves function to illuminate how suffering arises and how it may end. The Buddha did not claim ownership over his method, and so it remains available to reinterpretation without losing integrity. What endures most powerfully is the simplicity beneath complexity. Observe experience honestly. Notice craving and aversion. Recognize impermanence. Cultivate compassion. These principles do not require belief, only attention. This is why the Buddha's story resists closure. It does not conclude with a final revelation. It loops back into lived experience. Each moment of awareness becomes both beginning and continuation. In this sense, the Buddha's life does not sit apart from history. It dissolves into it, influencing thought not by force, but by resonance. The prince who walked away from certainty did not replace it with doctrine. He replaced it with a way of seeing, and that way of seeing continues wherever humans pause long enough to observe their own minds. The story does not demand reverence. It invites participation. And in that invitation, the Buddha remains present, not as a figure of the past, but as a living possibility within time itself.